Welcome to episode 2 of Climate Islands podcast. I'm Dawn Thomas, your host. We continue our sea journey across Papua New Guinea to assess the impacts of climate change on small and remote islands. In this episode, we set sail for the islands of Bougainville region and Milne Bay province to meet the islander communities who call these islands home. Our climate experts continue to learn of the daily struggles, especially the freshwater woes on these small islands. The islanders are hopeful their voices will soon be heard by world leaders and decision makers on how the climate crisis is affecting their lives and futures. In the words of Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, it is a wake-up call to instill a sense of urgency on the dire state of the climate process ahead of COP26. Joining us again, we have John Poulsen, team leader of the Building Resilience to Climate Change project with the United Nations Development Program in Papua New Guinea. John will share the insights from his visit to the island communities in Bougainville and Milne Bay province. Welcome, John. Very good to see you again. I'm looking forward to hearing about this journey. Can you tell us about this leg of the mission?
Thank you, Dawn. In 2021, the UNDP team, which consisted of myself, Bensolo Ken, and our lead consultant, Barbara Locus, led the joint mission of the Building Resilience to Climate Change project. The UNDP team also consists of Linda Capus-Barre and Fiona Sikula. And finally, we have engaged Tonkin and Taylor International to help with the analysis of the data that we collect. We departed by boat from Rabaul in eastern Britain, in the north of PNG, and sailed across to the Autonomous Region of Bougainville and onward to Milne Bay province, where we visited a total of 9 island and atoll communities. This mission, which also consisted of team members from the PNG Climate Change and Development Authority and provincial government officials, aimed to assess the vulnerability of these remote islands to the increasing impacts of climate change.
You mentioned that the team's mission was to assess the island's vulnerability to climate change. Can you explain how the islands were assessed?
The climate change vulnerability assessments were structured via interviews and consultations with the communities on each island. Based upon these assessments, small grant investment plans and proposals are being developed to plan and assist the communities to adapt toward a more climate-proof future. Climate change has had many direct and indirect effects on the island communities' daily lives, and one of the most common is access to fresh water.
From the information gathered on daily access to fresh water, how does climate change affect the water supply?
Rising temperatures cause increasing evaporation, and this causes again increasing atmospheric water or vapor content, which in turn leads to changing rainfall patterns, typically heavier, more intense, and more frequent downpours, with flooding and mudslides depending on the topography. Seawater intrusion or inundation caused by rising sea levels and stronger winds and waves further reduces access to and availability of the already limited freshwater resources. Salty seawater floods coastal aquifers where islanders draw their freshwater supplies, which is typically from wells.
I can only imagine the daily struggles. Is that common? Are many island communities suffering water shortages?
At virtually all the islands and atolls visited, most families and households are experiencing intensifying limited access to fresh and clean drinking water, as well as less and less available fresh water for growing food. This was a very common feature on the three islands which we visited in the Bougainville region, namely Feet, Nukuman, and Nukutoa. And this is also well illustrated by the conditions on the 6 islands visited in Milne Bay province. Budi Budi Island, some 24 hours sailing from Yanaba Egom Island, is one of the most isolated in Milne Bay province and is very flat and low-lying, which makes it one of the most exposed and vulnerable islands to climate change impacts. But coastal erosion is only one of the impacts from rising sea levels. The very limited water accessibility is at the core of the challenges faced by the community. There are severe food shortages during long periods of the year. Fish and coconut are the staple foods. In fact, during July and August this year, the provincial authorities had to organize emergency food deliveries to Budi Budi. Kitava, another island visited during the mission, has a rocky coast which protects the island itself from several of the typical threats from rising sea levels. The communities live on higher ground, so coastal erosion is not threatening the community's physical existence.
So the flat islands are the most impacted by rising sea levels?
Well, generally yes, but even on Kitava Island, the rising sea levels have severe impacts. Water access is the most important threat from climate change on the island, affecting virtually all communities. Inundation and salination from rising sea levels destroy and threaten the freshwater sources, which on Kitava are mostly located near the beach. Because Kitava is a completely rocky island, and because land areas are at too high elevation, there are virtually no wells. And also, a combination of longer lasting drought periods and increasing deforestation for food gardens result in steady soil deterioration and declining food crop yields. This is caused and exacerbated by the steadily growing population density.
We know women and children are often more vulnerable. How do the women and children cope with these harsh conditions?
On the remote Yanaba and Egom Islands, conditions were very harsh and challenging. On Egom, a small rocky island with very limited areas for food gardening and limited freshwater access, there were many malnourished children. Water-related illnesses like malaria, diarrhea, and skin diseases are common. The lack of water also has serious impacts on food security. On the other hand, on Yanaba, a much larger island, although there was also a desperate need for improved water access, there appeared to be less malnutrition and more available food. Yanaba has relatively more available land space for gardens and other purposes.
How will the BRCC project make a difference to these island families and communities?
The Building Resilience to Climate Change project identifies options for the communities to adapt to these challenges. This may include provision of water tanks, improvement and maintenance of wells, as well as ecosystem-based approaches, and improved soil and agricultural practices to ensure that the limited water resources are used more efficiently to reduce food insecurity. Most islands and atolls in Milne Bay are so isolated that they are practically out of reach from local government. This makes these communities very vulnerable, and it poses big challenges for the government to provide assistance and relief. Yet again, these challenges are only exacerbated by the fact that the government can only get in touch with some 13 out of approximately 140 inhabited islands and atolls in Milne Bay province due to the remoteness and associated poor communication infrastructure.
Being from Papua New Guinea myself, I feel a real responsibility. How can the world do more to help small island countries and communities?
The fate of the communities on these and thousands of other islands and atolls in Papua New Guinea and across the world is bleak. It will, in part, depend on how committed nations are to meet the Paris Agreement targets. COP26 in Glasgow during November 2021 will be a global event to discuss global climate change. But COP26 will feel very remote for these vulnerable communities in Milne Bay and elsewhere. And yet, the very impacts discussed at COP26 are real and they're local and are of existential importance to these communities.
Big thank you to John Poulsen of UNDP in Papua New Guinea for sharing his sea journey to assess vulnerable remote island communities in Bougainville and Milne Bay province as part of the Building Resilience to Climate Change project. Join us next time for Climate Islands podcast as we journey farther with John and the team to reach more inhabited islands in far-flung corners of our paradise, Papua New Guinea.